Hello and welcome to this first of 3 presentations on cyber threat management. My name is Philip King Wilson. I'm a visiting scholar at the University of South Florida. In this first presentation we'll be taking a look at the general concepts of risk management, and then we'll be delving deeper into cyber threat management and how that fits within the general domain of risk management. Once we understand the philosophies and methodologies, we can go into more detail from a cyber threat perspective. In parts 2 and 3 of these presentations, we'll be doing software walkthroughs of 2 different kinds of algorithmic modeling for cyber threats and seeing how we can actually develop a network value at risk. So that is the operational risk arising from connectivity between a corporate network and the internet.
Cyber threat management is related to a number of other management practices: business continuity, business analytics, enterprise risk services and solutions, risk consulting and insurance solutions. It plays a greater role within some than in others, but it's fair to say that it has a very broad scope within all organizations. It would also probably be fair to say that it plays a more fundamental part in business continuity and enterprise risk services and solutions than the others. In respect of business continuity, the deaggregation of processes, as we'll see later on, is a common theme to both business continuity management and cyber threat management. With regards to enterprise risk, IT risk and security plays a fundamental role in all enterprises, whereby it's a requisite that all threats posed to the organization are identified, analyzed and prioritized in order for risk management teams to prioritize risk reduction, elimination or mitigation according to the risk appetite of the organization concerned. If we think of risk being posed to an organization, this can take the form of very different contexts. For example, within the financial institutions context, we can view enterprise risk as being comprised of a number of different components, such as counterparty risk, market risk, event risk and operational risk, and then these being subdivided into sub-risks. Some of these risks will be solely applicable to one particular sector, whilst others are going to be generally applicable to all sectors and organizations regardless of size. So if we take the more generalized view rather than the financial services context specifically, we can eliminate several of the major components that comprise the highest priority for risk management teams within the financial services institutions, for example, credit risk, foreign exchange risk and interest rate risk. And therefore we can take a look at the operational and events risks in a slightly different manner and in more detail. Operational control risk is more to do with the general functioning of a business, that is, how the process is operated in terms of efficiency in order to generate the requisite output for each individual organization. By contrast, just about every sizable organization will have some form of project during its operational life, whether it's a one-man business, the project being the actual startup of that business, to a major organization seeking regulatory compliance for a new requirement being imposed upon it unilaterally and unexpectedly, for example. Transaction risk is an increasingly important one, and we only have to look at the target point of sale hack to understand this, and there are numerous other examples out there. And of course, systems risk. This doesn't necessarily have to be in-house systems. As we move further and further into the cloud computing environment and outsourced services, this aspect is going to become an increasing concern for most businesses. If we now take a look at event risk and what that is comprised of primarily, we're looking at risks that prima facie may not be applicable to small or medium-sized businesses. However, as everything moves online, reputation plays a far greater role for business selling online, advertising and marketing than has previously been the case. Your client's trust in your company can be achieved through historical branding, or increasingly nowadays through recommendation via social networking websites. Legal and regulatory risk is also playing a more important part, with far greater national and international regulations, or even at state level, begin to make themselves known to all companies. For example, in February of this year, the state of Minnesota changed the regulatory requirements for notifications of data breaches to a 48-hour window. Disaster risk. This can be viewed as any number of incidents, from physical threats such as flooding, earthquakes, fires, to anything that could be used as a tool against an organization. Political risk doesn't necessarily play such a fundamental role here in the States, but it would certainly be the case, for example, looking at what's presently happening in Eastern Europe, whereby political unrest can result in fragmentation of geographies and the political environment within a very short space of time. So if you have infrastructure spread across a country, such as the Ukraine, and suddenly some of it is ceded to Russia, there is an impact in terms of national infrastructure from an IT perspective. If we try to map operational risk, we can use the parameters of stake versus uncertainty, regain or losses, in order to plot where our priorities lie in terms of, for example, in stake the financial gain loss will usually take priority over everything else. However, reputation and image and strategic position are clearly intertwined and may change in their hierarchical order. With regards to uncertainty, regain or losses, these are the sources that will impact, but are not meant here to be an exhaustive list. It's simply providing an example. Probably the best way to understand the methodology here is to take a concrete example. So we're going to take reputation and image.
Here we can take a concrete example of a subject that's usually viewed as being more conceptual and non-data driven. That is brand and reputation within an organisation. So how can brand and reputation be fitted within the general risk management context? We'll take a look.
When we take a look at a company's tangible and intangible assets, we can see that the intangible within the organisation has assets that are protected by law, such as patents, copyrights and so forth, but there are other intangible assets that are not balance sheet permissible but are still critical to the operation of an organisation. We'll put those to one side right now and we'll carry on with our worked example here in terms of the other side of the balance sheet in permissible items. And relating this back to the operational risk map and stake within the stake, reputation and image, right at the bottom here we have brand. From outside the sectors of branding and marketing and advertising, brands are sometimes difficult to comprehend and viewed as ethereal as opposed to being a domain which is data-led, regardless of the fact that marketing comprises extremely high levels of mathematical skills and modelling in the modern day. However, if we apply a standard branding league table by means of explanation, this hopefully will become more understandable in this particular example. We have dimensions and business type. Just to explain quickly how this is intended to function, if we start at the first band, we have a brand structure with a level of public awareness that's required of the brand. Who's the target audience? Is it, for example, a small highly targeted group, or is it the general public at the other extreme of the scale? Is it on a local, national or international scale? And what are the brand attributes? So this latter can be activity based all the way through to trust. When we look at the culture of the brand, this is supposed to reflect the organizational culture and leadership style within it, where strategically the organization sees itself and what its underlying ethos is. Running along the bottom, the attributes of the organization can also be seen. Is it one that owns? So for example, that could be a holding company or an international conglomerate with multiple lines of businesses completely unrelated to each other. Or is it one that controls a hierarchy of brands within a segment, such as General Motors? Is it one that seeks to lead the pack within a sector in the form that Apple seeks to operate in terms of innovation and design? Or is it being one, the position whereby the organization sees itself as a large single entity? This is fairly common historically in the Far East, where Toyota, for example, is more of a business philosophy and has multiple business lines, international reach and working with suppliers, so you're seen as being a Toyota person. If we progress this example of the brand and reputational risk up to the furthest, that of being one, continuing on from the last slide, we have a large monolithic organization and the brand has a requirement of a high public awareness, and the internal brand attributes are of a most valued brand, and therefore the attributes are that this monolithic brand is trusted, and therefore in the context of our network risk, this is a brand that is highly susceptible to reputational damage in the event of a cybersecurity breach. And there are numerous examples of such types of company and the brand that has suffered as a result of a security breach. I've slotted in here just a few examples of monolithic brands with high visibility to illustrate the point that brand and reputational damage can be applied not just to the commercial environment but also to governments, regulatory bodies, and here in those examples which have a high reliance upon the trust of the general public, such as public transport organisations. So now we're going to move back towards the understanding of the processes of risk management. We're looking here at how do organisations take decisions within the company. For every decision there's a corresponding component depending upon whether there's an operational or strategic emphasis affecting such decisions. Generally speaking, a strategic emphasis will take a longer term view than an operational control emphasis. Therefore, the corporate strategy set out by the board will require operations management under business unit planning in order to execute the best to the organisation's ability. If we take a look at the strategic management relating to risk management, there is a very simple hierarchical structure that's easier to understand than in the previous slide, whereby the corporation sets out the objectives, determines its strategic plan, and this is broken down into the tactical plan at the business unit level, and then there's an overall operational plan. For the creation and determination of the strategic plan, there are a number of decisions clearly having to be made. This is again undertaken using structured methodologies, of which this is one, typically used within the decision-making process, whereby the goals are set, including various milestones and thresholds which need to be met or not breached. Problems are identified that may prevent the organisation in achieving its objectives, and then alternatives are identified as a means of achieving them. One or more are then chosen, tested, and the most effective one will be implemented and then controlled, although how they are controlled has changed from the old-fashioned command and control type of managerial system to a more dynamic and smaller teamed one. Risk management has a structured methodology which follows a different number of managerial systems. They have a tendency to express the same components each time, but this doesn't mean that they're no longer valid or relevant, and in fact, having been used for so long by companies and consultancies, one could argue that they've become a de facto standard for any project or program. So if we take the 5 components of this particular express methodology, which is obviously a high level one, and move on to one that puts more meat on the bones, we can see that there is in fact far more substance behind the high level presentation. When we translate it into the various operational risk stages, we can see that the traditional baseline requires internal controls, the usual audit function, individual mitigation programs, which are those actions required to mitigate each threat posed to the organisation, and then there is a reliance upon the quality of personnel and the culture of the organisation. When we come to awareness, cyber threats are a great example of this stage, whereby it's only in recent times that the major negative impact a successful cyber attack could have within an organisation has created an internal awareness of it. Also in this stage we have a process mapping, self-assessment and a collection of event data, and the establishment of a value proposition phase. Now this goes towards the creation of a business case or any risk management program for that matter. When it comes to monitoring in stage 3, there's absolutely no point in having a risk management program or even a risk management department if risk and threats are not monitored to ensure there's no breach of any set thresholds set according to the risk appetite of the organisation. How do you quantify? Well, there are a number of different databases around the world in terms of sectoral, operational, organisational specific data. For example, there's a global electricity power line database owned by the brokerage Willis, to which pretty much every world electricity generating company contributes data and is subscribed to it as well. At the same time, each organisation is seeking out competitive advantage through creating its own predictive modelling techniques. And finally, operational risk management begins being integrated into the organisation through having detailed information which is embedded within and across the company rather than being a silo-based culture, especially for the case of cyber threats, since there's a high level of correlation and interdependence between systems and business processes. Clearly, once the risks and threats have been understood, there is a requirement to bring them under control within the framework and the threshold set by senior management. This can be through risk financing, which we'll cover in part in section 3 of these presentations.
So far we've seen that all the risk management actions have been corporation based, but it's really important to understand there are other agents at play here that actually determine and impact on how an organisation will define its risk management strategy, its objectives, its methodologies. So for example, that would be regulators, lawmakers, those undertaking audits internally and externally, and others that come into play.
Allied to operational risk stages is operational risk phasing. There are essentially 3 different phases the organisation will go through, the first being to develop the appropriate risk management environment for that specific organisation. The next phase is managing risk by identifying, measuring, monitoring and controlling, as in the operational risk stages, but there are 2 additional phases which are the role of supervisors and that of disclosure. Fitting into the supervisory framework shouldn't be underestimated, especially within the cyber threat environment due to the proliferation of a number of different regulatory requirements appertaining to data security and integrity in terms of cross-border flows of information. The thresholds at which supervisors will regulate an industry vary enormously. For example, in the banking sector, oversight of supervisors is clearly critical, as is the case in the aerospace and nuclear sectors as well, for example. Failures of supervisors in recent times have led to the global financial crisis, a Japanese nuclear power plant accident, and a manufacturer of aircraft suffering battery fires. The 4th phase of disclosure may appear to be something of a low priority item relative to the rest. However, in the cybersecurity environment, this is the opposite. So traditionally, public disclosure of risk exposure and the quality of management, and particularly risk management, has been used to signal to a number of different audiences. Firstly, to supervisors, they say, look, we have the ability to understand and control our risks. Secondly, to competitors in the market, they say, we are the best performers in risk management and we are therefore the de facto standard and our brand is the strongest. And this can be used to ward off hostile takeover bids or to assist when joint ventures or acquisitions are sought, such as in the case post the financial crisis where JP Morgan leveraged its image as having managed the crisis the best and used that to make strategic acquisitions in the fallout. And finally, to the general public, historically it has been more important within some sectors and business lines than others, but the internet has created a need for the brand to be valued in the market to overcome the increased transparency of pricing and product information, which has created a degree of homogeneity. It has become in many cases a question of, do I trust them to rectify any issue I may have with the product, and a recourse ultimately to the most trusted brand by the consumer. Now let's take a look at the basic operational risk model. Again, this one is based upon the financial services and banking sectors, not for any particular reason. It just happens to be a very good structure which is easy to follow, and additionally, for the most part, the majority of the components within the model are applicable to all sectors. Once again, if we remove the components that are banking and financial services specific and focus upon operational risk components, you'll see that there are those which are common to any operational risk model. In particular, business process mapping, loss data collection, scenarios, and environmental scanning. Environmental scanning is when you look external to the organization for relevant data, and typically this is a practice used in benchmarking exercises. As we mentioned before, the type of risk management operation run within a company needs to be the most appropriate one for the organization concerned. In mapping the various components within value-based risk management, we can use a shareholder value objective as one axis and the level of risk management sophistication required for the other. So there is a correlation between the level of cash flow maximization as an objective and the degree of sophistication of the risk management that needs to be employed in achieving this. At the other end of the scale, protection against unforeseen losses does not have a high level of risk management sophistication. This is because the latter is valued as a risk portfolio management exercise rather than a dynamic activity and one that requires the organisation to link risk management with operational performance. What's changed in more recent times is the fact that cyber threat management has changed to being part of the path upwards in terms of maximisation of cash flows. How so, you may ask? Well, the degree of process dependency upon which IT systems is such that a cyber attack can now affect quality of earnings and maximisation of cash flows. Additionally, how that risk is managed will have an impact upon capital allocation. If we now take the other components of operational risk management and depict them in a cycle, central to all the components is information support, and in its absence all the other components can't function correctly. Over the past decade or so, the risk management hierarchy has changed fundamentally in that IT is no longer viewed as something that sits within the IT department in this functional silo and therefore not an area of concern for senior management. However, the importance of risk management as a discipline has overridden everything that went before, and within that rise has been IT security risk management. This includes business continuity planning version 1, by the way, since the late 2000s, since this was incorrectly viewed as a one-time exercise in many quarters, both operationally from the organisational perspective, but also from the consultancy and supplier perspective. So now we have the board of directors who are responsible for both the corporate and risk strategy of the organisation, with each being fed by the other and with input to and from the risk management committee. The operational risk committee is generally comprised of the chief risk officer and the management of the business units. Then the head of operational risk, so the chief risk officer covers all risks within the organisation and the operational risk head will report into them. The business unit operational risk staff and the function heads report into the operational risk head. So far we've seen that operational risk is a structured method within an organisation. Options for risk management are fully accept the risk, eliminate the risk completely, or in between that mitigate the risk. For the last two options there will in all likelihood be a cost component to them. Each option will probably have a number of different scenarios, each with a variation of cost and complexity, in-house or outsourced, and with a temporal component too. That is it urgent or is there a longer term insidious risk that needs addressing? In order for the senior management to decide upon which option should have which level of priority, it's necessary to build a business case. It's worth noting, however, this isn't necessarily a cost-benefit analysis of each mitigation or elimination option. There may be other reasons why one option is selected over another. So, for example, sometimes projects will never produce a return on the capital allocated to it, but they'll still go ahead because they provide a short-term soft benefit that will benefit in the long term. These are generally labelled as enabling projects, and examples can be where the risk culture of an organisation needs changing, or from an IT example, this would be where one long-standing software application needs to be phased out for whatever reason, but the employees resist, so a middleware component is implemented despite it adding cost and complexity without a revenue offset. Similarly, it can be that there's no option, such as in the case of a compliance project. For cyber threat management, a quick win that costs money in the short term is gluing the USB ports of all machines with epoxy resin. And that might sound strange, but this can lead to a change in worker behaviour and attitudes in sharing USB sticks or bringing them into the workplace, and so it serves a purpose, but at a cost. So far we've mentioned that a risk management program should be appropriate for the risk appetite of the company. So how is the risk appetite actually set? Well, once again there'll be substantial input by the business unit departments into the program, which in turn is fed to the chief risk officer, often via the operational risk chief as we saw before. Each department will depend upon a number of sources of information, and they'll have various tools and analytics available to them in order to create their departmental input.
So from the example just given of threat data modelling, within the methodology it's critical that it's fully understood what the interaction and interdependencies are between processes, systems and categories. And in this form it's very akin to business continuity planning, where you're de-aggregating processes to see where each dependency lies. A good example of this would be within the telecoms business, where on average there are 20 to 30,000 different processes. Trying to de-aggregate those to any fine detail requires specific tools. The benefit that such industries have is that they assign process owners who actually understand each part of the process that they're responsible for in very fine detail. They work with risk management teams, IT teams, and business continuity teams to actually understand on an ongoing basis what the underlying threats are, how they can be managed, are there any requirements for change within the infrastructure, for example.
We're looking here at a representation of the risk cultures and attitudes that vary from sector to sector, and this isn't static either. If you think about the mature, stable sectors of old, these were the utilities, staples, core product sectors such as electricity production and distribution, water, gas, food, telephones. There was little or no focus upon risk management because they were effectively closed-loop systems and often they are government controlled or owned. However, we're now in an environment where threats to those sectors have fundamentally changed the company's attitude towards risk and risk management. If you think of food security, regenerative power, embargoes upon foreign telecoms equipment suppliers, and this is just for example. There are many sectors that have had to change their positioning on risk. So there are clearly risk factors, the external operating environment and organisational factors, all of which impact upon the setting of the organisation's risk appetite. Whether that is a strategic element or an organisational psychology one, the degree of uncertainty, or in the ability to identify, assess, quantify and model. There's also frequently not a single influencing factor but two or more simultaneously. In the case of technology and the operating environment, this is certainly the case. Some processes are totally integrated with IT systems, some are still totally manual, and many are hybrid. With security, the landscape can effectively be divided into bands of activity, that is, detection collection, aggregation, and finally calculation and reporting. We can view the first two bands as being a mature activity whilst the third is actually still emerging, in so much as the tools we have to data mine and to use for both security and for legal and regulatory compliance are developing at a fast rate because corporations are caught between two shifts simultaneously. They have an increasing need to streamline processes through leveraging IT in order to maintain at the very least their competitiveness. And secondly, they have increasing pressure to ensure they comply with more and more laws and regulations requiring them to find technological solutions. So a concrete example here would be the anti-money laundering laws, or AML, which affect every financial institution. In this sector, the previous edict was to make sure the institution knows their client and therefore knows where their funds are coming from. Now the regulation requires them not only to know their client but also know their client's clients, so that the institutions need to check every single transaction. And the end result of this is a huge additional cost for the banks, brokerages and financial services organisations, in that technology has enabled them to benefit from straight-through processing, internet banking operations and so on, and thus drive down cost per transaction and raise profits. Now they have to use technology to track every single transaction without a financial component to offset these additional costs. Relating this back to our slide, the institutions have an additional cost, the developing of data mining and algorithmic modelling of the transactional behaviour of each client, and this is creating a vast number of false positives. So now they've had to put back the human into the loop, adding complexity and cost back into business operations that shifted from manual to hybrid in order to be integrated. In the future, all efforts are therefore going to be on developing technology and models to reduce the false positives, which is still being able to prove regulatory compliance to supervisors. This is one example, but data and privacy laws are having the same effect on most corporations as well as all sizes of business. A good example of this change in technology and behaviours is internet banking. Strategically, as we've previously said, technological leverage enabled the banks to massively reduce the cost per transaction. Traditionally, they had core banking technology at the centre of the organisation, and the bank branches had the second level of technology that interacted with the core. You as a customer would go to the branch and interact with the staff, and they in turn would use their client computers to interact with the core. This meant that the banks could create a very protected environment and hardened technological security. And this shift wasn't just a sectoral one, by the way, it was a globally economic one. In Europe, for example, the poorer and least economically developed countries and regions such as Italy, Spain and Portugal used this shift to create an industry and generate GDP growth that enabled them to catch up with the richer northern European countries. And don't forget, we're only talking about a short period ago here. Now we have effectively reversed the whole structure, so the end user interacts with the core systems directly, taking the need for physical branches and personnel out of the equation. Coupled to this, however, is the fact that the impact on network security is also reversed, with the banks now being dependent upon the end user for security. Hence all those notifications of changes of terms and conditions we all receive from the banks, who are trying to cover their risk exposures by limiting their liability. Now, this all seems to be a great value proposition for the banks as well as external suppliers. IBM made fortunes in the developing markets by implementing and operating entire banking operations in some countries such as Portugal. However, if you take a look at the overall savings within the business model, they were in general far lower than expected in any country that introduced internet banking and trading. So the question is why? Well, this relates to my last point, to remember that it's not just technology that shifts, but the behaviours of users as well. In this case, the business case was based upon the traditional model of people waiting for their monthly bank statements once a month or per week and using the information in them to base their purchasing decisions upon. Now though, in the internet banking environment, people were checking their bank balances even several times a day and making far more smaller frequent transactions online, and all these take a percentage of the margin that was assumed to be within each transaction. In the same way, if we base our cyber threat management or indeed any risk management programs upon non-evolving assumptions as to behaviours, we risk not losing money, but also the risk is really of losing data, being prosecuted for non-compliance, fined, as well as losing funds. Nowadays we have a higher degree of control of certain business activities, again through technology enablement. Data mining and technology process integration means that whilst we're able to control, for example, sales and marketing effectiveness, this is tied inexorably with a simultaneous shift in earnings impact speed towards immediacy. So now we're going to move further down the line towards the development of a cyber threat management program by firstly looking at an example of a company's IT systems and how they relate to the various business functions within it. These are obviously high-level descriptions and each would have multiple layers below the top-line description. However, as an example, the point I'm trying to make here is that IT is so deeply embedded into all organizations that it's used constantly for both operation and control, and this is linked to the earnings impact speed of a negative event, requiring us to increasingly understand exactly what data is being generated and how best to use it, not just for security and business continuity, but for every function from compliance to processes or even personnel performance monitoring. When organizations are seeking to change their processes in order to either maintain or improve efficiencies, the role of IT becomes even clearer, insomuch as firstly the overall strategy and all operations will be reviewed and plans developed for the business architecture. Secondly, the processes will be mapped in order to design the process flows, and then the major phase will involve IT in order to execute the process improvements, and it becomes further and further integrated into every company. Now we have reviewed how IT is utilised and embedded within just about all business activities, we can carry that forward and see how it affects the development of a cybersecurity program. Here we have a schematic of a typical cyber threat management program and the interaction and information flows necessary for this to function effectively. Within the organization there will be a program project management team responsible for the overall program, but they don't simply act as a standalone unit. It's key that there is a program board for reasons that are explained later. The composition of the board will vary sector to sector and between organizations within each sector, dependent upon the program objectives and how it will be operated. The program will be dependent upon the tools and methodologies that are available to it, and these will obviously be a variable again between corporations. These tools and methodologies are in turn dependent upon the data that will feed them. In this example, the components of the program data are pretty much what every organization would require in order to develop a minimal cybersecurity program. So the components are obviously a network risk assessment and systems analysis. This will enable a data security assessment program, which can in fact turn out to be a major project all on its own. The infrastructure needs to be mapped and the processes deaggregated. As we've said previously, this data is usually held via the business continuity program of the organization, but this still needs to be checked for status and whether it needs updating. The other thing that will be required is the creation of a prediction engine in order to take account of infrastructure, process and data changes, and this includes internet traffic in and out from the internet to and from the organization. The reason this is crucial will hopefully be self-evident later on. If we now take all the components, we can now walk towards modeling cyber threats. We can see here that there are two key components within the model that require us to both A. Map the linkages between business processes and IT systems, and B. Define the value of each process.
So from the example just given of threat data modeling, within the methodology it's critical that it's fully understood what the interaction and interdependencies are between processes, systems and categories. And in this form it's very akin to business continuity planning, where you're deaggregating processes to see where each dependency lies. A good example of this would be within the telecoms business, where on average there are 20 to 30,000 different processes. Trying to deaggregate those to any fine detail requires specific tools. The benefit that such industries have is that they assign process owners who actually understand each part of the process that they're responsible for in very fine detail. They work with risk management teams, IT teams and business continuity teams to actually understand on an ongoing basis what the underlying threats are, how they can be managed, are there any requirements for change within the infrastructure, for example. Unfortunately, many operational risk management activities are viewed as a sunk cost, and this has particularly been the case for IT and IT projects that are viewed as being within functional silos rather than being within the organisation in general. This results in a great deal of internal politics coming into play in terms of the risk management strategy and options. So for example, an operational risk management committee may provide several mitigation options that on the face of it offer a cost-benefit positive to the organisation and therefore logically should be implemented, and yet they're turned down. For this reason, it's recommended that risk management is run as a general project within an organisation using the hierarchical structure and methodology that is endemic within various project management plans such as PRINCE2 or the Project Management Institute here in the US. We won't go into the details of project management, and if you have a look online you'll see the relevant information.
And what is the definition of a process? A dictionary definition discloses that it's a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. We can therefore define it as being composed of a series of elements, each of which is linked to the next. If we take this basic precept, we can then expand on the number of elements that comprise a process. And then we can add a description of each element so that we start to form a process flow. We can then combine the elements to include a further step to link an event or trigger and a machine, the latter of which can be a proxy for an IT system, for example. So here it could be a trigger at midnight daily that triggers the process of data backup that uses a second rack of servers to transmit the data to a second data center during the backup of the daily sales reports being generated. If we take this even further, we can generate an IDEF diagram, IDEF. IDEF is a modeling language developed by the military originally in the 1970s, and it's now used generally in modeling systems and software engineering. Nowadays, business process engineers have a number of software toolkits to assist them in the development of process maps, but these are essentially the same paper-based inputs as traditional practitioner process maps. These inputs comprise the overall process and are highly detailed. Undertaking process mapping is useful for business continuity planning, but also for process improvement, as we've seen, and it also plays an important role in cyber threat management modelling. One thing to remember though is that in many countries process mapping has either not been undertaken at all or it's in its infancy, the Middle East for example. And you may find that even in long established corporations in the US don't have up-to-date mapping because technological developments haven't been taken accounted for or frequently enough, and this will impact in a major way on any cyber threat management program. If we now relate this back to the model, we're now able to analyse the data and determine the network value at risk and arrive at an organisation's risk exposure. This gives the management the option to manage the risk level through executing various mitigation options. This is undertaken in conjunction with business units, and effectively this is a capital modelling exercise in much the same way as other operational business activities are assessed for capital efficiency. A cost-benefit analysis is undertaken for each risk mitigation action, and the Chief Risk Officer will inform the Risk Management Committee of the findings and make recommendations.
Unfortunately, many operational risk management activities are viewed as a sunk cost, and this has particularly been the case for IT and IT projects that are viewed as being within functional silos rather than being within the organisation in general. This results in a great deal of internal politics coming into play in terms of the risk management strategy and options. So for example, an operational risk management committee may provide several mitigation options that on the face of it offer a cost benefit positive to the organisation and therefore logically should be implemented, and yet they're turned down. For this reason, it's recommended that risk management is run as a general project within an organisation using the hierarchical structure and methodology that is endemic within various project management plans such as PRINCE2 or the Project Management Institute here in the US. We won't go into the details of project management, and if you have a look online you'll see the relevant information.
Ideally, there should be a cycle coupling the corporate risk strategy with the cyber risk strategy of the organisation. The degree of importance attached to cyber threats and data security is slowly changing mindsets within senior management, but there's still a long way to go in some countries and within some sectors. Laws and regulations are playing their part in this, as we've mentioned, but until enforcement is more effective and compliance failures made more public, there'll still be a dependence upon companies to police themselves and to determine their own cyber threat management acceptance levels. Where corporations have an effective risk management program in place, then the organisation will generally have developed the appropriate risk culture for its risk appetite and also to be compliant with the various laws and regulations imposed upon the sector. It's worth noting here that in many instances there are both direct and indirect benefits of having an effective risk management program, in that in some cases risk capital can be reduced, and this may be a regulatory or a legally stipulated requirement, such as the capital adequacy ratios in banks being linked to their detailed risk exposures. Indirect benefits can be from messaging to the market and therefore the supervisory bodies and the market makers that the risk management executed in a corporation is best in class and as such deserving a higher credit rating and thus lower cost of capital to that organisation.
Coming up in parts 2 and 3 we'll cover cyber risk valuation, cyber threat measurement, cloud computing, the use of various algorithms for modelling, and where the future lies in terms of cyber threat management.